The sun hung low over the Montana plains. In the summer of 1907, casting long shadows across miles of prairie grass that swayed like an ocean of gold. In this vast, unforgiving landscape where a man's word was his bond, and the law of the land often bent to those with the deepest pockets, an old black horse stood tied to a fence post, ribs showing through his dull coat like the bars of a prison. His name was Quincy, though few remembered it anymore, and fewer still cared. The world had decided he was worthless, a burden, something to be used until there was nothing left. But one man, a rancher named Jacob Saunders, couldn't look away. What began as quiet observation would ignite a battle that would divide a community and force every soul in the territory to answer one simple question: does compassion matter more than property rights? This is a story of courage, of standing up when silence would have been easier, and of an unlikely friendship that challenged everything the Old West stood for. Before we continue, if you love stories about rescued horses and the incredible bonds between humans and animals, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Your support keeps these tales alive. Now, let's get back to Jacob and Quincy. Jacob Saunders had worked the land for 32 years, ever since his father passed and left him the ranch at 19. Now at 51, his hands were calloused thick as leather, his face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the cracked earth after a drought. He was a man of few words, the type who believed actions spoke louder than any sermon. His ranch sat on 200 acres of decent grazing land, with a modest herd of cattle and 3 good horses that he treated with the same respect he'd give any working partner. His property bordered that of Vernon Hayes, a man as different from Jacob as lightning from steady rain. Hayes had inherited wealth from back east, had purchased his sprawling ranch 5 years prior with money that hadn't been earned through sweat or soil. He was loud where Jacob was quiet, flashy where Jacob was practical, and cruel where Jacob was fair. The two men had exchanged perhaps a dozen words since Hayes arrived, and Jacob had been content to keep it that way. But that changed the day Hayes brought home Quincy. It was early spring of 1906 when Jacob first saw the black gelding being led from a livestock trailer. Even from a distance, across the property line marked by a sagging fence, Jacob could see the horse was old. His muzzle had grayed, his movements careful, his eyes carrying the weight of years spent in harness and saddle. Hayes had purchased him from a freight company in Billings, paying bottom dollar for what the company considered a worn-out beast, no longer fit for hauling wagons through the mountain passes. At first, Jacob thought perhaps Hayes had bought the horse for light work, the kind an older animal could handle without strain, checking fence lines maybe, or pulling a small cart. It was what any decent rancher would do, give an aging horse a few comfortable years before letting him pass naturally in a good pasture. But Vernon Hayes was not a decent rancher. Within the first month, Jacob noticed the horse being worked harder than any animal that age should be. Hayes had him pulling a full plow through rocky soil, the kind of work that would strain even a young, strong horse. Jacob would see Quincy in the fields, Head low, sides heaving, while Hayes cracked a whip above him, shouting commands that echoed across the valley. Jacob's jaw would tighten each time he heard that whip crack. His own horses were never struck. A firm word, a gentle hand. That was all it took when you'd build trust with an animal. But he kept his observations to himself. A man didn't interfere in his neighbor's business, not in 1906 Montana. Property was property, and livestock was considered the same as any other tool. What Hayes did with his horse was by law and custom his own affair. The weeks turned to months, and Jacob watched Quincy grow thinner. The black coat lost its sheen, becoming dull as ash. The horse's gait changed, developing a limp in the right foreleg that worsened with each passing day. Still, Hayes worked him sunrise to sunset, hitching him to wagons loaded with stones, forcing him to drag timber from the forest line. Jacob found himself making excuses to work the eastern pasture, the one closest to Hayes's property, just so he could check on the horse. He told himself he was inspecting his fence line, looking for breaks that might let cattle through. But the truth was harder to admit. He was keeping vigil over an animal that wasn't his, that he had no legal right to protect, that belonged to a man who would sooner shoot him than accept criticism. It was during one of these vigils, on a scorching July afternoon, that Jacob saw Vernon Hayes strike Quincy across the face with the handle of a shovel. The horse had stumbled, exhausted from hours, pulling a loaded cart across uneven ground. He'd gone down on his knees, unable to rise immediately, and Hayes had responded with violence. The sound of wood connecting with flesh carried across the distance, followed by Quincy's cry of pain, a sound no horse should ever make. Jacob's hands clenched around the fence post he'd been pretending to repair. Every instinct screamed at him to vault that fence, to put himself between that horse and that man. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. But he stood frozen, trapped between what he wanted to do and what society permitted him to do. When Quincy finally struggled to his feet, blood trickled from a cut above his eye. Hayes kicked him forward, and the old horse limped on, pulling his burden with the grim determination of a creature that knew resistance would only bring more pain. That night, Jacob sat on his porch long after sunset, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The Montana sky stretched vast above him. Stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. Somewhere across the property line, Quincy stood in a bare paddock, without shelter, without adequate water, without anyone to care whether he lived or died. Jacob thought about his own father, a man who taught him that strength without compassion was just brutality, dressed up fancy. His father had once traded a month's profit for a lame horse nobody wanted, had nursed that animal back to health, and had gotten 5 good years of gentle work from him before letting him pass peacefully in a sunny pasture. We're judged by how we treat those who can't fight back, his father had said. Jacob set down his glass and made a decision. Tomorrow he would try to reason with Vernon Hayes. He would offer to buy Quincy. Would pay more than the horse was worth if that's what it took. It was A long shot. Hayes was stubborn and prideful. But Jacob had to try. He couldn't stand by and watch while an innocent creature suffered within sight of his own home. The next morning, Jacob crossed the property line with his hat in his hands, approaching Hayes's ranch house with the caution of a man entering a snake den. The house was grand by frontier standards. 2 stories of painted wood with a wide veranda built to impress rather than to withstand the harsh winters. Hayes was on that veranda, boots propped up on the railing, smoking a cigar that probably cost more than Jacob spent on supplies in a month. "Hayes," Jacob called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "Got a moment?" Vernon Hayes looked down at him with the amused contempt of a man who considered himself superior in every way that mattered. He was 43, still possessed of the softness of someone who'd never known real hardship. His face flushed from good living and too much whiskey. "Saunders," he drawled, smoke curling from his lips. "What brings you to my side of the fence? Your cattle break through again?" "No, sir. I came to talk about your black horse, the older gelding." Hayes's expression shifted. Amusement replaced by something colder. "What about him?" Jacob chose his words carefully. "I've noticed he's been working pretty hard. Thought maybe given his age, you might consider selling him. I could use another horse for light work around my place. Be willing to pay fair price." The silence that followed was heavy as storm clouds. Hayes swung his boots down from the railing and stood, cigar clenched between his teeth. When he spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of neighborly politeness. "You got some nerves, Saunders, coming onto my property, telling me how to manage my livestock. That's not what that horse is mine, bought and paid for. What I do with him is my business. You understand that? Or do I need to explain property rights to you like you're some kind of simple-minded fool?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I meant no offense, just making an offer. Your offer is refused. Now get off my land before I forget we're neighbors." Jacob stood his ground for one more moment, his eyes meeting Hayes's without flinching. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back toward his own property. Behind him, he heard Hayes spit and mutter something about self-righteous fools who don't know their place. That morning, as if despite Jacob's interference, Hayes worked Quincy harder than ever. Jacob watched from his pasture as the old horse pulled a plow through soil that should have been worked by 2 animals, not one. He watched as Quincy stumbled repeatedly as the whip cracked above him as the sun beat down without mercy. And he understood with a sinking feeling in his gut that his attempt to help had only made things worse. The summer of 1906 burned itself out, giving way to autumn's chill. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, then shed their leaves like tears. Through it all, Jacob watched Quincy deteriorate. The horse had developed sores on his shoulders where the harness rubbed, had grown so thin that his hip bones jutted like mountain peaks. His limp had worsened until he could barely walk. Yet. Still, Hayes demanded work from him. Jacob began documenting what he saw. He wasn't sure why at first, just an instinct that evidence might matter someday. He kept a journal noting dates and observations in his cramped handwriting. August 12th, horse worked 8 hours in full sun without water. Break, collapsed twice. September 3rd. New wounds on back, consistent with whip marks. October 7th, horse not given adequate shelter during first frost. Other neighbors noticed, too. The Calloway family, whose ranch lay to the south, mentioned it to Jacob one Sunday after church. Emma Calloway, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and 5 children, had pulled Jacob aside in the churchyard. "It's not right what he's doing to that horse," she'd said quietly, her voice tight with anger. "My youngest boy saw Hayes beating him with a chain last week, cried himself to sleep over it." "I know," Jacob had replied, the words tasting like ash. "Well, what can be done? I tried buying the horse." Hayes refused. Emma's expression had hardened. Then, maybe it's time folks stop trying to be polite about it. That horse is being tortured, Jacob. Right out in the open, where God and everyone can see. But what Emma called torture, the law called property management. There were no animal cruelty statutes in Montana Territory in 1906. A man could work his horse to death, beat it, starve it, and face no legal consequences as long as it was his horse. The animal was property, no different than a plow or a wagon wheel. And property rights were sacred, especially in a place where the law was still finding its footing. Still, Emma's words haunted Jacob. She was right. Torture was exactly what it was, and everyone who looked the other way was complicit. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from Canada with teeth of ice. The first major storm hit in mid-November, dropping 6 inches of snow overnight and plunging temperatures below freezing. Jacob made sure his horses had adequate shelter, thick bedding, and extra feed to help them maintain body heat. It was basic animal husbandry, the minimum any responsible rancher would do. Vernon Hayes did none of it. Quincy stood in that same bare paddock, now covered in snow, without so much as a lean-to for protection. Jacob could see him from his kitchen window, a dark silhouette against white ground, head lowered against the wind, body trembling. That was the breaking point. Jacob pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and marched across the property line through knee-deep snow. He didn't care about property rights or social conventions or the potential consequences. That horse would not freeze to death while he stood by doing nothing. He reached Quincy and saw up close just how dire the situation had become. The horse's coat was matted with ice, his body shaking so violently it seemed he might collapse. His eyes, once probably bright with life, were dull and resigned. Open sources had cracked and bled in the cold. This wasn't an animal. It was suffering given form. "Easy, boy," Jacob murmured, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "I've got you." He removed his own coat and draped it over Quincy's back. Inadequate, but better than nothing. Then he did something that would change everything. He opened the paddock gate and led the horse off Hayes's property. He moved quickly, expecting at any moment to hear Hayes's shout to see him emerge with a rifle, but the house remained dark, and Jacob managed to get Quincy across the property line and into his own barn without incident. Inside, out of the wind, Jacob worked by lantern light to tend the horse's wounds. He rubbed Quincy down with dry sacks, applied salve to the worst sores, and offered hay and warm water. The horse ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might be taken away. "You're safe now," Jacob said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was lying. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Quincy turned his head, those dim eyes focusing on Jacob's face. And in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding perhaps, or just the desperate gratitude of a creature finally shown kindness. Jacob spent the night in the barn, dozing fitfully on a pile of hay, checking on Quincy every few hours. The horse remained standing through the night, too exhausted or too traumatized to lie down, but he seemed calmer, more at peace. Dawn came gray and cold. Jacob was mucking out the stall when he heard the sound of boots crunching through snow. He looked up to see Vernon Hayes storming toward the barn, his face purple with rage. "Where is he?" Hayes roared. "Where's my horse, you thieving son of a..." "He's here," Jacob interrupted, stepping out of the barn to block the doorway. "And he's staying here." Hayes's hand went to the pistol at his hip. "That's theft, Saunders. I could shoot you where you stand, and the law would back me." "Then shoot me," Jacob said quietly, his own hand nowhere near the rifle, leaning against the barn wall. "But you'll have to, because I'm not giving him back to you." They stood there in the snow, two men representing two different codes of honor. Hayes had the law on his side, the clear right of property ownership. Jacob had nothing but the conviction that some things mattered more than law. "You're finished," Hayes finally spat. "I'll have the sheriff here by noon. You'll hang for horse theft." "Maybe," Jacob acknowledged. "But at least I'll hang knowing I tried to do right." Hayes wheeled and stormed away, his threats echoing across the frozen landscape. Jacob watched him go, then turned back to Quincy, who stood at the barn door, watching him with what might have been trust beginning to kindle in his eyes. "Well, boy," Jacob said softly, "I've either saved your life or ruined mine. Possibly both." True to his word, Hayes returned before noon with Sheriff William Dalton. The sheriff was a reasonable man, respected in the community, but he was also bound by law. He dismounted his horse with obvious reluctance and approached Jacob, who stood waiting outside his barn. "Jacob," the sheriff greeted him, his tone apologetic. "I'm real sorry about this, but Hayes has filed a complaint. Says you stole his horse." "I took him," Jacob corrected. "But I didn't steal him." "There's a difference." "Not in the laws." "Eyes, I'm afraid. Property is property, even when taking that property saves a life." Sheriff Dalton sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. He was 58 years old, had served as sheriff for 22 years, and had seen enough of human nature to know that legal and moral didn't always align. "Show me the horse," he said finally. Jacob led him into the barn. Dalton's expression shifted when he saw Quincy. The protruding ribs, the open wounds, the barely healed cut above the eye. The sheriff had grown up on a ranch, knew horses as well as any man, and couldn't hide his shock. "How long has he been like this?" Dalton asked quietly. "MS. Getting worse all the time. I tried to buy him from Hayes. Offered twice what he's worth. Hayes refused." The sheriff circled Quincy slowly, his trained eye taking in every detail. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with suppressed anger. "This is neglect, pure and simple." "Then do something about it," Jacob pressed. "I can't. There's no law against it. A man's entitled to work his livestock as he sees fit. Even if it kills them." "Even then," Dalton replaced his hat, his expression troubled. "I don't like it any more than you do, Jacob. But my job is to enforce the law, not to make it. And the law says Hayes owns that horse, which means you taking him as theft." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So what happens now?" "By rights, I should arrest you, bring you before the judge, let Hayes press charges." The sheriff paused, then added carefully, "But I'm going to give you 24 hours to reconsider. If you return the horse to Hayes by this time tomorrow, I'll convince him to drop the charges. You'll avoid a trial, maybe even jail time. And if I don't, then I'll have no choice but to arrest you. And Jacob," Dalton's voice softened, "you'll lose. The law is clear. You took another man's property, and no judge in Montana will side with you on this, no matter how righteous your intentions." After the sheriff left, Jacob stood in the barn with Quincy, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like physical force. He could return the horse, save himself from legal consequences, go back to his quiet life. Quincy would suffer, would probably die within months, but Jacob would be in the clear. Or he could refuse, face arrest, trial, possible imprisonment, risk losing his ranch, because how would the cattle be tended if he was in jail? But Quincy would live, at least for a while. At least long enough to know kindness. That evening, Emma Calloway appeared at his door with a pot of stew and determination in her eyes. "The whole county's talking about it," she announced, setting the pot on his stove. "Without invitation. About you taking Hayes's horse." "I expect they are," Jacob said wearily. "Good, because it's about time someone stood up to that man. My husband wants you to know we support you. So do the Bishops, the Farrells, and at least a dozen other families I can name." Jacob looked at her in surprise. "That won't matter in court." "Maybe not, but it matters in the town. We're tired of watching Hayes lord over everyone, treating animals and people like they're beneath him. You did what needed doing. And there are folks willing to say so." Hope flickered in Jacob's chest, fragile as a candle flame. "Say so where?" "Wherever it counts. We've been talking About calling a community meeting. Let people voice their concerns. Put pressure on the territorial legislature to pass some kind of protection for animals. It's 1906, for heaven's sake. We've got automobiles and telephone lines. Maybe it's time we had laws that match our values. Jacob felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone in this. The realization was both comforting and terrifying, because now others were willing to put themselves at risk alongside him. When? He asked. Saturday night, the church hall. Will you come? Will you tell people what you've seen? Jacob thought about his father, about those words that had haunted him for months. We're judged by how we treat those who can't fight back. I'll be there, he said. The church hall was packed on Saturday night. Seemed like every rancher, farmer, and towns folk within 20 m had turned out, drawn by gossip and curiosity, and in some cases genuine concern. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting dancing shadows across the rough wooden walls. The air was thick with the smell of wood, smoke, wet wool, and nervous sweat. Jacob stood at the back, hat in hands, watching the crowd file in. He recognized most faces, neighbors he'd known for years, families he'd helped during hard times, men he'd worked alongside at harvest, but there were also strangers, people from neighboring counties who'd heard about the dispute and come to witness what they sensed was an important moment. Emma Calloway had organized the meeting with the efficiency of a military general. She'd arranged for speakers, had contacted a lawyer from Helena who specialized in property law, and had even invited a representative from the territorial legislature. Though whether the man would show was anyone's guess. Vernon Hayes was there, too, sitting in the front row with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He'd brought his own supporters, other wealthy ranchers, who saw this gathering as a threat to property rights, as the first step toward government overreach into private affairs. Sheriff Dalton sat near the door, his presence a reminder that this meeting, however passionate, had no legal authority. At the end of the day, the law was what it was, and feelings wouldn't change it. Emma called the meeting to order by ringing a handbell, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward the front where she stood, beside a simple wooden podium. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. We're here tonight to discuss a matter that concerns not just one horse or one man, but our entire community and what we stand for. I've asked Jacob Saunders to speak first, to tell you what he's witnessed. Jacob made his way to the front, acutely aware of every eye on him. He'd never been comfortable speaking in public, had always preferred the quiet company of animals and land to the scrutiny of crowds. But when he reached the podium and looked out at all those faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some actively hostile, he thought of Quincy standing in that barn, finally safe, and found his voice. Most of you know me, he started simply. No, I'm not one for making speeches or causing trouble. I keep to my land, do my work, mind my own business. That's How I was raised, and that's how I've lived. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But this past year, I've watched something that I couldn't mind my own business about anymore. I've watched my neighbor, Vernon Hayes, work an old horse near to death. I've watched him beat that animal, starve him, leave him without shelter in the winter cold. I tried to buy the horse, offered fair price, and more was refused. So when that horse was standing in a blizzard, with no protection, shaking so hard I thought he'd fall over dead, I made a choice. I brought him to my barn. A murmur ran through the crowd. Hayes shot to his feet. That's horse theft, he shouted. Plain and simple. This man is a criminal, and instead of being in jail, where he belongs, you're letting him preach at us like some kind of saint. Sit down, Hayes, someone called from the back. Let him finish. Hayes remained standing, but Jacob continued, his voice steady. I know what the law says. Sheriff Dalton's explained it real clear. That horse is Hayes's property, and taking him was theft. I don't dispute the legal facts, but I want to ask everyone here a question. Is there no point where the law and what's right stop matching up? Is there no line where a man's treatment of an animal becomes so cruel that we're obligated to step in? Law or no law? He let the question hang in the air. Several people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. I've brought the horse here tonight, Jacob continued. He's outside in my wagon for anyone who wants to see what I'm talking about. See the scars, the wounds that haven't healed, right? The way he flinches when you raise your hand too quick. Then you tell me, should I have left him to die? Should I have respected property rights over a living creature's suffering? The hall erupted in competing shouts. Some stood to applaud Jacob. Others Jared. Hayes was screaming about the sanctity of property, about slippery slopes and government tyranny. Sheriff Dalton rose to his feet, calling for order. Emma rang her bell again, sharp and insistent, until the crowd quieted enough to hear her voice. Everyone will get a chance to speak, but one at a time, civil-like. This is a community meeting, not a bar fight. For the next 2 hours, the debate raged. One by one, people stood to voice their opinions. A grizzled rancher named Bill Frell spoke about the tradition of the West, about how a man's property was sacred, because without that, you had chaos. Today it's a horse, he warned. Tomorrow, it's someone saying you work your cattle too hard or your chickens don't have nice enough coos. Where does it end? But Emma Calloway countered with passion in her voice. I've got 5 children, Mr. Farrell, and I'm teaching them right from wrong. What kind of lesson does it teach when we say it's acceptable to torture an animal as long as you own it? Are we raising our children to be compassionate human beings? Or are we raising them to believe that might makes right and money matters more than mercy? A young school teacher named Helen Pritchard stood, her voice shaking but determined. I have my students read from the Bible every morning. Matthew 25 says, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. I believe that extends to all God's creatures. How can We call ourselves Christians and allow suffering when we have the power to stop it? The lawyer from Helena, a sharp-eyed man named Douglas Whitmore, provided legal perspective. Currently, Montana territory has no statutes addressing animal welfare. This puts us behind states like New York and Massachusetts, which have had such laws since the 1860s. There is precedent for legal protection of animals and there is momentum nationwide for such reforms. The question before you isn't whether protection is possible, it's whether you want it for your community. The territorial legislature representative, a portly man named Benjamin Guthrie, had indeed shown up. He listened to hours of debate before standing to speak, his voice carrying the weight of political authority. I've heard the concerns raised here tonight, he said carefully. And I've seen this debate playing out across the territory. What you're asking for, legal protection for animals, is not a simple matter. It requires defining cruelty, establishing enforcement mechanisms, balancing property rights against welfare concerns. But he paused significantly. It's not impossible. If enough communities voice their support, the legislature will listen. This sparked renewed debate. Some saw hope. Others saw government overreach. The argument circled around and around until finally Emma suggested the crowd go outside to see Quincy for themselves. They filed out into the cold night, breath-fidging, boots crunching on frozen ground. Jacob's wagon stood in the churchyard, and in the back, covered with blankets, but still visible in the torchlight, stood Quincy. The crowd fell silent as they gathered around. In the flickering light, the horses' condition was undeniable. Even those who'd come prepared to defend Hayes's property rights found themselves unable to look away from the evidence of prolonged suffering. A woman gasped. A child began to cry. Men who'd branched their whole lives shook their heads in disgust. Vernon Hayes pushed through the crowd, his face red with fury. That horse is mine. This is a legal display of stolen property. But when he reached to grab Quincy's halter, the horse reared back with a terror that needed no words. He pulled against the rope, eyes rolling white, a sound of pure fear escaping his throat. It was the reaction of an animal who knew his abuser. Jacob moved quickly, placing himself between Hayes and Quincy, speaking softly to calm the horse. Easy, boy. Easy. You're all right. Quincy settled at the sound of Jacob's voice, pressing close to him. Trembling, but trusting. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The fear Hayes inspired versus the trust Jacob had earned. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his hand raised. That's enough. Hayes. Back away. This is an outrage. That's my property. And you'll get your day in court too. Prove it, Dalton replied, his voice hard. But right now you're disturbing the peace. Move along. For a moment it seemed Hayes might push the issue. Then he saw the faces surrounding him. Not hostile exactly, but cold. Unsympathetic. He was outnumbered, not just in bodies, but in public opinion. "This isn't over," he snarled, then stalked toward his horse, mounted up, and galloped off into the darkness. After he left, the mood shifted. People approached Jacob, some to offer support, others to ask questions. Emma organized a quick vote, a show of hands for those who wanted the territorial legislature to consider animal welfare laws. The majority raised their hands. It wasn't legally binding, carried no official weight, but it was a statement, a community declaring its values, saying that some things mattered more than tradition or property rights or the way things had always been done. As the crowd dispersed, Sheriff Dalton pulled Jacob aside. "You know, I still have to enforce the law as it stands," he said quietly. "Hayes is filing charges. There'll be a trial." "I know. But between you and me, I hope you win. And I'll be talking to Judge Morrison before the trial, making sure he knows public sentiment won't change the law. But judges have discretion in sentencing. Might make a difference." It was as much as Jacob could hope for. The trial was set for 3 weeks later in the county courthouse in Helena. In the time between, Jacob's story spread beyond his small community. Newspapers picked it up. The story of a rancher facing prison for saving an abused horse resonated with people across Montana Territory and beyond. Letters arrived at Jacob's ranch, some supporting him, others condemning him, but all proving that what had started as one man's decision had become something larger. Emma and her network of supporters raised money for Jacob's legal defense. Douglas Whitmore agreed to represent him pro bono, seeing the case as an opportunity to set precedent. Dr. Henry Moore, a veterinarian from Helena, offered to examine Quincy and provide expert testimony about his condition. Quincy himself grew stronger each day. Proper feed, clean water, warm shelter, and gentle treatment worked miracles. His wounds began to heal. His coat regained some luster. And though he would always carry scars, physical and otherwise, he started to seem less like a broken creature and more like a horse who might remember what it felt like to live without fear. Jacob spent hours with him each day, not just caring for his physical needs, but rebuilding trust. He spoke softly, moved slowly, never raised his hand in anger. Gradually, Quincy began to relax in his presence, to nicker softly when Jacob approached, to rest his head against Jacob's shoulder. In moments of quiet connection, the day of the trial arrived cold and clear. The courthouse was packed, spectators filling every seat and lining the walls. Vernon Hayes sat with his expensive lawyer, confident in the strength of his legal position. Jacob sat beside Douglas Whitmore, his callous hands clasped tightly, knowing that the law was not on his side, but hoping that justice might be. Judge Arthur Morrison presided, a stern man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen 4 decades of frontier justice. He called the court to order and listened as Hayes's lawyer laid out the case. "This is a simple matter of property law, Your Honor. Mr. Hayes legally purchased the horse in question. He has the bill of sale. Mr. Saunders admitted to taking the horse from Mr. Hayes's property. without permission. That is by definition theft. We ask that the court find it for the plaintiff and order the immediate return of the horse plus damages for the inconvenience and legal costs. Whitmore stood to present Jacob's defense. Your Honor, while we don't dispute the facts of ownership, we ask the court to consider the context. The defendant acted to prevent ongoing cruelty to an animal. We have documentation of neglect spanning months, eyewitness testimony and medical evidence showing severe mistreatment. Mr. Saunders attempted to purchase the horse legally and was refused. Only when the animal's life was in immediate danger. During a winter storm did he intervene. He paused, then added, furthermore, we argue that this case represents a conflict between legal precedent and evolving moral standards. Across this nation, communities are recognizing that animals deserve legal protection from cruelty. We ask this court to be forward-thinking to set a precedent that property rights do not include the right to torture. The testimony began. Dr. Moore took the stand, describing in clinical detail the condition Quincy had been in when he examined him, the malnutrition, the infected wounds, the signs of chronic abuse. He showed photographs that made spectators gasp. That had Emma Calloway wiping tears from her eyes. In my professional opinion, Dr. Moore concluded, this animal suffered severe and prolonged neglect. Had intervention not occurred, he would have died within weeks, possibly days. Hayes's lawyer tried to discredit the testimony, suggesting the injuries could have occurred after Jacob took the horse, but the doctor held firm. These wounds show patterns of healing consistent with months of abuse, not days or weeks. Next, several neighbors testified to what they'd witnessed. Emma Calloway described seeing Hayes beat Quincy with a chain. Bill Frell, who'd initially opposed Jacob at the meeting, admitted he'd seen the horse being worked despite obvious lameness. Even the sheriff testified, describing Quincy's condition when he'd investigated the theft complaint. Then came Hayes's turn. He took the stand with false confidence, describing his version of events. That horse was property I purchased legally. Quote, he insisted, I worked him as any rancher works livestock. If he had some injuries, well, that's the nature of work animals. I never meant him harm, but I also didn't appreciate some holier-than-thou neighbor deciding he knew better than me how to manage my own property. Did you provide adequate shelter during the winter storm? Whitmore asked during cross-examination. He had survived storms before. That's not what I asked. Did you provide shelter? Hayes's jaw tightened. I didn't think it was necessary. Did you reduce his workload when he developed a limp? Horses get sore. It passes. Did you provide medical treatment for his wounds? Wounds heal on their own. With each answer, Hayes sealed his own fate in the court of public opinion, if not of law. The spectators shifted, murmured, some shaking their heads in disgust. But the legal facts remained unchanged. Quincy was Hayes's property and Jacob had taken him. Finally, Jacob himself took the stand. He spoke simply without embellishment, describing months of Watching Quincy suffer, his attempts to intervene legally, and finally his decision to act. I knew it was against the law, he admitted. I knew there would be consequences, but I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I stood by and did nothing. My father taught me that we're measured by how we treat those who can't defend themselves. That old horse couldn't defend himself, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything but endure. So, I had to defend him, even if it meant facing this courtroom. The judge listened to everything with an impassive expression, occasionally making notes. When testimony concluded, he called for closing arguments. Hayes's lawyer hammered on property rights, on the dangerous precedent of allowing vigilante justice, on the necessity of respecting legal boundaries even when emotions ran high. Whitmore countered with a passionate plea for the court to recognize changing times and values. We are not arguing for chaos, Your Honor. We are arguing that the law should reflect our highest values, not our lowest tolerances. We are arguing that compassion is not a crime and that standing up for the voiceless should be commended, not punished. When both sides had finished, Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The courtroom held its collective breath. This case, the judge began slowly, presents a conflict between established law and evolving moral standards. The legal facts are not in dispute. Mr. Hayes owned the horse. Mr. Saunders took the horse without permission. That constitutes theft under Montana law. Jacob's heart sank, but the judge continued. However, the testimony presented has demonstrated beyond any doubt that the animal in question was subjected to treatment that any reasonable person would consider cruel. Furthermore, Mr. Saunders attempted to resolve the situation through legal means before resorting to direct action. His motivation was not personal gain, but the prevention of suffering. The judge paused, letting his words settle. I find Mr. Saunders guilty of the technical charge of theft. However, given the extraordinary circumstances, I am suspending any jail sentence. Instead, I am ordering Mr. Saunders to pay a fine of $1, the symbolic value of acknowledging that the law was broken, while also acknowledging that sometimes moral imperatives supersede legal technicalities. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others protested. Hayes leapt to his feet, shouting objections, demanding the horse be returned to him immediately. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. I am not finished. When silence returned, the judge's expression hardened. As for the horse, I am ordering an independent evaluation by Dr. Moore and 2 other veterinarians. If they determine the animal requires ongoing medical care or would be at risk of further harm, I am prepared to declare the horse unfit for work in order that he remain in Mr. Saunders' custody for humanitarian reasons. We will reconvene in 1 week for that determination. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was more than Jacob had dared hope for. As the courtroom cleared, people surrounded him, shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder, promising support. Emma hugged him fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." But Jacob knew the fight wasn't entirely over. They had one more week, one more evaluation, one more chance for Hayes to reclaim Quincy. That week was the longest of Jacob's life. 3 veterinarians examined Quincy thoroughly, documenting every injury, every sign of past abuse, assessing his current health and future prognosis. Jacob spent every day working with the horse, showing how much trust they'd built, demonstrating that Quincy was not just recovering physically, but healing emotionally. When they reconvened in court, Dr. Moore presented the panel's findings. "In our collective professional opinion, this horse has suffered trauma that would make him unsuitable for hard labor indefinitely. Furthermore, he has demonstrated clear signs of fear and stress when in the presence of Mr. Hayes, but shows calm and trust with Mr. Saunders. For the animal's welfare, we recommend he remain in Mr. Saunders' care permanently." Judge Morrison didn't hesitate. The court accepts the recommendation of the medical panel. Permanent custody of the horse is granted to Mr. Jacob Saunders, with the condition that the animal receive ongoing care and not be subjected to labor beyond his capabilities. Mr. Hayes's property claim is overridden on grounds of animal welfare. Vernon Hayes stormed from the courtroom in fury, threatening appeals and lawsuits that would never materialize. But Jacob barely noticed. He thought only of Quincy, waiting back at the ranch, finally and legally free. The victory in the courtroom resonated far beyond Jacob Saunders and one old black horse. News of the case spread through newspapers across Montana Territory and beyond, carried by telegraph wires to distant cities where people read the story over morning coffee and felt something stir inside them. A recognition that maybe the old ways needed changing, that maybe compassion could be written into law. 3 months after the trial in the spring of 1907, the Montana Territorial Legislature passed the Animal Welfare Act. It wasn't perfect. It covered only horses, cattle, and working animals, and the penalties for violations were modest. But it was a beginning. For the first time in the Torito's history, there were legal consequences for cruelty, legal protection for creatures that couldn't protect themselves. Emma Calloway had lobbied hard for it, organizing letter-writing campaigns and bringing delegations to Helena to testify before committees. She'd become something of a local hero. And Jacob knew that without her organizing genius, his individual act of defiance would have remained just that, individual with no lasting impact. But it was the impact on his own life that struck Jacob most profoundly. His ranch, which had felt haunted by silence and loss for so many years, became a different place after Quincy came to stay. The old horse would never pull a plow again, would never be subjected to hard labor. But he didn't need to. He simply lived, grazed in the pasture, walked the fence lines with Jacob on quiet mornings, stood in the barn during storms with his head lowered in contentment, and he trusted. That was the miracle that Jacob never took for granted. An animal who had every reason to fear humans, to flinch at every raised hand, instead chose to rest his head against Jacob's shoulder, to follow him across the pasture, to nicker softly when he heard Jacob's voice. Neighbors noticed the change in Jacob, too. The hard edges that grief had carved into him seemed to soften. He smiled more, spoke more freely, even attended the occasional social gathering without looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. It was as if saving Quincy had somehow saved a part of himself he'd thought lost forever. One evening in late June, Emma Calloway stopped by the ranch. She found Jacob in the pasture sitting on a fence rail, watching Quincy graze alongside his other horses. "He looks good," she observed, climbing up to sit beside him. "He does," Jacob agreed. "Put on weight. Coat's filled in. Even moves easier now. That Dr. Morrison fixed up that leg." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The kind that comes from shared struggle and mutual respect. "You know what people are calling you in town?" Emma asked, a smile in her voice. Jacob grimaced. "I can imagine. The horse savior. Some of the children draw pictures of you. You're a hero, Jacob Saunders. Whether you like it or not, I just did what needed doing. That's what heroes do. They do what needs doing when everyone else is too afraid or too comfortable or too convinced that it's not their problem." Jacob looked at her. This fierce woman who'd turned one man's act of defiance into a movement, who'd fought alongside him when it would have been easier to look away. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. "Without all of you, Emma, Bill, the Pritchards, everyone who stood up at that meeting, you turned what could have been just one stubborn fool's mistake into something that mattered. Maybe," Emma allowed, "or maybe you gave us permission to care out loud. Sometimes people need someone to go first, to show them it's possible to stand up against wrong, even when it's hard." As the sun dipped lower, Quincy lifted his head from grazing and walked toward them. He approached Jacob without hesitation, pressing his graying muzzle against Jacob's leg. Jacob reached down, running his fingers through the coarse mane, and felt the familiar surge of protectiveness and affection. "What will you do with him?" Emma asked. "Now that he's truly yours, let him be a horse." Jacob replied simply. "Let him live out his days eating good grass, sleeping in a warm barn, never knowing fear again. That's enough. That's everything." Quincy's dark eyes, clearer now than they'd been in months, looked up at Jacob with what seemed like understanding, or perhaps gratitude, or perhaps just the calm contentment of a creature finally at peace. On a crisp October morning in 1908, nearly 2 years after that winter storm, when Jacob had first crossed the property line to save a dying horse, he stood in his pasture and watched Quincy run. The old gelding couldn't run fast or far, but he ran nonetheless. Head high, tail streaming behind him, moving just for the joy of movement. No whip drove him. No burden weighed him down. He ran simply because he could, because he was free, because somewhere in his scarred heart, he remembered what it felt like to be a horse and not a tool. Jacob felt his throat tighten watching it. He thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The decision to stop when others drove past, the courage to act. When action meant risk, the willingness to stand in a courtroom and admit he'd broken the law because some things mattered more than law. He'd faced judgment, had been called a thief and a fool, had risked his freedom and his reputation. But standing here now, watching Quincy move freely in the morning light, Jacob knew he'd make the same choices again in a heartbeat. Because this side of an old horse, finally knowing peace was worth everything. As the sun climbed higher, Jacob called out, "Quincy!" The horse's ears swiveled toward the sound. He slowed, turned, and trotted back toward Jacob with the eagerness of someone approaching a friend. When he reached the fence, he pressed his head against Jacob's chest, exhaling contentment. Jacob wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his forehead against the warm, solid presence. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for teaching me that I could still care about something enough to fight for it, for reminding me what it means to be alive." Quincy stood steady, patient, his dark eyes half closed in peace. He'd been abandoned, abused, nearly destroyed by cruelty and neglect. But he'd survived. And in surviving, he'd saved the man who saved him. Together they stood in the Montana sunshine, rancher and horse, both bearing scars, both carrying stories of pain transformed into purpose. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying their story across the plains. A story that would be told and retold, that would inspire others to act when they witnessed suffering, that would remind future generations that courage and compassion could change the world, one life at a time. And though neither Jacob nor Quincy would ever be famous beyond their corner of Montana, though their names would eventually fade from memory, the ripples of their story would continue outward, touching lives they'd never meet, inspiring changes they'd never see, proving that one person's decision to stand up against wrong could echo through time. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below. Your engagement means everything and helps me continue sharing these powerful stories of rescue, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story. These tales need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Thank you for being part of this community that believes every life deserves compassion, every creature deserves a voice, and every act of kindness ripples outward to change the world. Until next time, remember we're all measured by how we treat those who can't defend themselves.